The MacBook Pro 16 and its predecessor, the MacBook Pro 15, have generally been considered as the powerhouses of the Apple portable computing lineup. The first version of the MacBook Pro 16 came out with some very beefy Intel processors that might not have held up as well as some other CPU lineups. Whereas the newest MacBook Pro 16 comes equipped with a full suite of Apple's finest chipset technology. So when we pit the old versus the new, which one comes out on top? Let's find out. What's up, everyone? I'm the Everyday Dad, and if I can figure it out, you can figure it out. I've been waiting to make this video for basically 2 years. You might not realize it, but the original MacBook Pro 16 was one of the very first times that I dipped my toes into the water of making computer content and more general tech-related content. At the time, I didn't end up sticking with this because my MacBook Pro 13 was all of the power that I needed, but when the Intel MacBooks came out on the Apple refurbished store, I bought this on the refurbished store, and I was all about it as my main computer for a very long time until macOS Catalina made me switch to Windows for a while. But time has definitely not stood still, and while the 9th gen Intel Core i9 was a big star back in its day, well, these are the new days now that Apple fields its own processor, the M1. In this version of the MacBook Pro 16, we've got more cores, more GPUs, more screens, more ports, well, more basically everything. Quick note before we go much further, no one provided me either of these laptops. I paid for both of them out of my admittedly much lighter wallet. And let's quickly knock out the specs and ordering information so we can all get on the same page as to what's inside and outside of these. Look how big these things are. These are some giant laptops. First, let's start with the oldie but goodie. The 2019 version of the MacBook Pro 16 came in at a base price of $23.99. For that money, you got the 6-core 9th generation Intel i7 processor, 16 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM, a 512 gigabyte solid state drive, and an AMD Radeon Pro 5300M graphics card. You could take that base model and bring it all the way up to an 8-core i9 processor, 64 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM, an 8 terabyte solid state drive, and after a yearly refresh, you could get up to a Radeon Pro 5600M with 8 gigabytes of HM2 memory. I don't exactly know what HM2 memory is, but it sounds really fancy. And this titan of technology would cost you over $6,000. I don't remember the exact number after the 5600M was added, and now Apple doesn't have them on their website, but it was very expensive. That's a ton of power, and a ton of computer, especially for back in 2019. The M1 MacBook Pro 16 base model comes in at a little higher at $24.99. For this money, you'll get the 10-core M1 Pro processor, a 16-core GPU, 16 gigabytes of unified memory, and a 512 gigabyte solid-state drive. Much like those previous versions, you could take this all the way up to ludicrous levels with that top-of-the-line 10-core M1 Max processor, 32-core GPU, 64 gigabytes of unified memory, and a very similar 8 terabyte solid-state drive. Here I do know how much this is going to cost, and it costs a painful $6,099, which let's all say together, oof. My version that I've got today has the 10-core M1 Max processor, 32 gigabytes of unified memory, and a 1 terabyte solid-state drive. So let's start with the outside and work our way in. The body of these two laptops look almost like they are from different manufacturers. The Intel MacBook Pro 16 was designed under the smaller is obviously better and is the only thing that matters umbrella, where the M1 16 definitely is looking to be the best computer it can be, even if it's a little chunkier. Port-wise, in the Intel 16, you'll get 4 Thunderbolt 3 ports. And that's it. Oh, you get a headphone jack too. Now, I love me some Thunderbolt ports. They're very versatile and they're very powerful, but these were the dark days of being an Apple user. On the M1 16, you get a little more flexibility. True, you have lost one of the Thunderbolt ports. You only get 3 Thunderbolt 4 ports on this laptop, but you get an SD card slot and an HDMI port. And man, do I sleep so much better at night knowing that that HDMI port is there, and I am not ashamed to admit it. Plus, on the M1 Mac, you'll get a slightly redesigned keyboard that has no touch bar, thank goodness. Yes, the keys are very similar between the two laptops, they just look cooler on the M1 version. Oh, and the M1 version has a row of function keys where the touch bar would be on the Intel. It's like everything that I've wanted, everything that I complained about on this was fixed on this version. I could see an argument that the full aluminum look is pretty nice too. There are folks that are gonna miss the nice clean aluminum look of this, but I vastly prefer the keys on the M1 Max. Speaking of those keys, both set of keys are amazing to type on. I actually typed this entire script on my MacBook Pro 14, and being back on an actual Apple laptop keyboard, it's just fantastic. Easily my favorite keyboards in the business. It's just clicky enough to be satisfying, but it's so easy to get into a nice typing rhythm and just smoothly glide over the keys. If you look above that keyboard, you'll see the redesigned display. Now, what's cool on the Intel version is it itself was a redesign from the MacBook Pro 15. It had slimmer bezels, and it still looks sharp. And I feel like this right here was when Apple's screen design really started to kick into gear. And you can really see that on the follow-up because the bezels are even thinner, giving us a 16.2-inch display that that is literally breathtaking the first time you see it. You will get the dreaded notch in the M1 version, and while I'm not the biggest fan of it, I personally haven't had any issues with it yet, either on this or on the 14-inch. The display on the Intel was very sharp. It had P3 color gamut, could go up to 500 nits of brightness, and at the time was very nice to look at. And today, it still does not look bad. But the M1 has up to 1000 nits of brightness, 1,000,000:1 contrast ratio, and ProMotion built in, allowing it to move between 24 and 120 Hz depending on what's going on the screen. We will talk about the actual power differences of the computers in a minute, but the biggest feeling change that you'll see is absolutely the fast screen refresh rate. Everything that you do on this computer will feel so much smoother and crisp while using this newer MacBook that even if the power difference wasn't as big, you'd be hard pressed to tell because everything just feels better to work on here. Sitting on top of that display on both models are the integrated webcams. On the original MacBook Pro 16, it has a very disappointing 720p camera. That was Apple's staple until just right now. It's fine, but it's never been anything better than fine, and if you compared it to anything that the competition was doing, it's downright awful. The MacBook Pro 16 from this year does have a 1080p camera built into that notch, and the camera itself has a physically larger sensor. It's still a little tight for me too. I hope in future models they'll put in the ultra-wide-angle camera from the iPad lineup, either the iPad Gen 9 or the iPad mini. I think that would be the perfect MacBook teleconferencing camera. I'm also not an audiophile, but both computers have absolutely some of the best speakers in the game. I was very impressed with the older MacBook Pro when it first came out, and while technically the newer one is better, I see people talk about it all the time, I can't really hear the difference. But I know, folks I follow online certainly seem to be able to explain that it's better, so I'll believe them. Either way, both are incredible. Now let's move on to the internals between the two. Here it's going to be pretty cut and dry, mostly. The biggest internal difference between these two computers, besides that monstrous M1 Max processor, is the Intel Mac is running on an x86 architecture version of Mac OS, while the M1 Mac is running on an ARM-based architecture. You don't really need to understand the specifics between the two, just know that the two are mostly incompatible with each other, and they do take some very different approaches to similar tasks. When it comes to raw power, the M1 Max inside of my version of the 16 roundly stomps all over the 9th gen Intel Core i9, in both terms of single-core and multi-core tests. It's just a crazy powerful chip that is probably the strongest processor I own, and if it's not, it's neck and neck with the far more power-hungry Ryzen that I use in my custom-built PC. That's not to say the Intel version is a weak computer. It's not. It's just an older processor built on much older chipset manufacturing techniques. The M1 Max is built on a 5nm process that Intel to this day cannot compete with. If you needed to run simple like office job type programs, you'd still be fine with the Intel MacBook Pro 16, but if you need power, the i9 just can't keep up. Graphically, the older MacBook can't really get a break either. You might think that because it has a dedicated graphics card in it, hey, maybe it can win over the integrated graphics found in the newer kid. But still, no dice. The 32-core GPU for my MacBook Pro 16 laughs at pretty much every graphical task I throw at it. Combined with the CPU, I'm able to render out legit 4K files in almost triple real time. It takes 3 minutes and 30 seconds to export a 10-minute clip in Final Cut Pro, and DaVinci Resolve renders at 95 frames per second. Holy crap. But here's the best part. Even if Intel could close the gap in power, you wouldn't want it to. This was the last power machine from Apple that still sounds like a darn jet engine or hairdryer if you want to do any of those power tasks. The poor Apple chassis here is doing its best to try to cool down that beefy Intel CPU, and it does a valiant effort. There are no real thermal problems here, but dang, does it put up a fuss when you want it to work. The M1 MacBook Pro 16 has thus far been totally silent for me. That was true when running those CPU benchmarks, which if you don't know, they run the CPU full out for 10 minutes and not a single noise. That's true when I edited all of my MacBook Pro 14 videos from yesterday on it, and that continues to be true as I've used it throughout the days. One of the biggest selling points of moving to the M1 Max for me is how little you have to be irritated by fan noise throughout the day. You might think that's a small thing to complain about, but let me tell you, it will absolutely irritate you to no end once you make that transition. And lastly, let's talk battery life. This part actually might be a little funny. So the Intel MacBook Pro 16 is rated at 11 hours of battery life. And you know what? That's pretty good. It's not great, but it's pretty good even today. The M1 MacBook Pro 16 is rated to 21 hours of battery life, basically double what the Intel version can do. It does all of that with the stronger processor and all of that crazy screen stuff we talked about earlier. The real innovation Apple's been able to pull off with their own chips is not necessarily that they are powerful, it's that they are efficiently powerful. So you get things like crazy battery life. You get things like super cool and thermally well-managed ventilation. And on top of that, you will still get Cinebench scores rivaling custom-built PCs. I cannot overstate how good it feels to use the Apple laptops with the M1 processor of all flavors built into it. Every single one of the M1 MacBooks is incredible in its own way. But at the end of the day, so what, right? Would I recommend you upgrade from the Intel MacBook Pro 16 to the M1 MacBook Pro 16? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. This is better in every single way except one. The Intel MacBook Pro 16 can still run Boot Camp and install Windows, while none of the current MacBooks can say the same. That's the only single thing that I would say, okay, maybe don't upgrade. The new MacBook Pro 16 is faster, it's quieter, has a better screen, more ports, more everything. It's objectively the better laptop, and it's so much better in every single way. I really had to rein myself in a ton writing this script, because what I really wanted to do was just turn into the M1 MacBook's computer day. It's going to get its own follow-up video and all of that stuff, so I wanted to make sure that we were more comparing instead of just saying, look at the M1 MacBook Pro 16. I personally could not go back to the noise problems with the older Intel Macs, and I don't necessarily recommend that you do it either. And if you like this video and you would like to see my unboxing and initial impressions of this gorgeously gigantic laptop, you can find my video for that by clicking right here. Click, 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 click. Thanks for watching.